Tonight we're in Parashat Toldot, which is Genesis 25 through 28. It's only 3 chapters this week, but believe me, it's hard even with 3 chapters. But we're gonna plow through, and it's gonna be great. Now, I'm not going to hit real heavily, I don't think, on some of the stuff that you might be anticipating, because I know you know a lot of this stuff like by the back of your hand. But nevertheless, let's see what we have here. So, in the first thing that I like to do is just give you a Parsha overview. And the overview of this section is in Genesis 25. You have the text tells us that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rivkah, and that she is childless, and that he prays for his wife to have children, and the Lord hears his prayers. But we also note that when she gave birth to their first child, he was 60. So there's a 20-year interval in there. Does it mean that he was praying for 20 years? Probably. I think that most young Hebrew couples would be anticipating babies just as soon as possible. So it seems to me that they waited for some time in prayer. In Genesis 25 part B, I'll call it, Rivkah receives a prophecy regarding her pregnancy because she feels the sensation of something is terribly wrong inside me. And she goes to seek answers of Yehovah, and he gives her a prophecy regarding those 2 children inside her womb. And then we have in Genesis 25 also, Rivkah giving birth to the twins Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esau. And then we have in the end of 25, Esav trading his right of the firstborn for a meal of like beans, some kind of red kidney beans stew or something like that. And then in Genesis 26, this is quite fascinating because, Isaac is a very enigmatic, mysterious figure in the Torah. He doesn't appear very much. There's only that little introduction there where it says that he prays for his wife. And then in the next chapter, 27, he's saying goodbye to Jacob as he's sending him off to Uncle Laban to run from his brother who's trying to kill him. And right in the middle, you got one chapter of him traveling to the land of the Philistines and digging some holes in the ground. And that's all. That's all you get about Isaac. It's a rather mysterious section, and yet I think it's profound. So we'll discuss that a little bit more. And then in chapter 27, we have the act of deception, where Rivkah, acting on her prophetic vision, decides to take matters into her own hands and procure the firstborn blessing for her favored son, Yaakov. And he does receive the blessing. Esav receives, I don't know if you could call it a backhanded blessing. And then in chapter 27b, we find Jacob it is determined that the wives of Esav that he had taken from among the Hittites were a great trouble to the family. And so Rivkah determines for herself and discusses with her husband, we have to find a wife for Jacob that is not among these people. So they have a little discussion regarding sending him away. And then in Genesis 28, they do send him away, and we have a renewal of the covenant blessing with Jacob. His father kind of reiterates and expands just a little bit on the blessing that he had received while he was being tricked and deceived because of his blindness. Did you want to say something, John? Oh, you look like you were about to ask a question. Okay, so first I want to deal with the conception and the revelation of Rivkah and the conflict that seems to be coming right up here for the brothers. Now, first of all, we have 20 years of marriage with no children, and we have the same type of a situation that Abraham and Sarah had, only they seem to have waited for a considerably longer period of time. I mean, Sarah was 90 when she finally gave birth to that son. But Isaac and Rebekah don't engage in any, I call them machinations. Hey, or sleep with my handmaid, and maybe God's going to fulfill his promise that way. Or eating mandrakes, love apples, whatever you want to call those. You remember that? That's coming up in another couple of Torah portions. Where one of the daughters of Laban is like, just hook me up with some mandrakes. Maybe that'll help me have children. It was Rachel. So they don't seem to go through any kind of struggle trying to figure out how they're going to get pregnant. It just says that Jacob prayed for his wife, that she would give birth. And it says that God heard him. I remember, though, that's 20 years' time. It's a long time. And I think one of the points that I would draw from this section is in regards to him praying for his wife, that often I know, at least for myself and for some of you that I've spoken to, or in just other people that I've spoken to about prayer, that prayer is a very difficult thing for people. Understanding what prayer is, understanding how we can anticipate God answering prayers, understanding whether we should anticipate God answering prayers, how God answers prayers. But I think one of the things, especially when challenges come our way, and I know this is true for myself, is it literally will take me a day or so to really get to the place of prayer, because there's a bit of frantic, hectic freaking out. It's like when a situation hits, you complain and you fret. And to me, that's somewhat akin to what Paul tells us in the book of Romans, where he says that the Spirit joins us in our weakness with groanings too deep for words, because we don't know how to pray as we ought to. Yeah. That, to me, seems like probably the prime time when the Spirit is coming forward to help you when you're in the midst of this freak-out session. And I think as our faith grows, hopefully that period of fretting and complaining and talking about it with others and coming up with scenarios in our mind, worst case scenarios, and how am I going to get out of this situation, hopefully that period shrinks, that as our faith grows, that period shrinks and we are more capable of regaining our mental composure and getting to God a little bit more quickly, and maybe saving some wear and tear on our brains and our worry lines and all this kind of stuff. But I find that that's the case for me. When challenges come, I sometimes just complain and fret, but I don't actually get to the praying, And I think and what I mean by that, is praying with purpose is what I guess how I would characterize it. And that would be to be clear and specific with God regarding, of course he knows what you're going through, but I think it's helpful for us to articulate to God exactly the struggles that we're dealing with, and to be very specific about what do we need? What do we need? What kind of help do we need? And being clear and specific and declaring our will. Now you know where I'm headed with this, because this is our will. My will is that you would do this, and I think that's totally okay to speak that to God. Do you want to know what the will of your children is? You did when you have children. You want to know what's on their mind, what trouble they're having, and you want them to ask you for help. You may or may not be able to help them in the way that they'd like, or you may not be willing to help them in the way that they'd like. That's a big thing too, because you're wiser than they are, and the help that they're asking for would not be particularly helpful. God is the same way, only much more so, I think. If our love for our own children is this big, then his love for us is this big. And the wisdom and the guidance in that help is much, much greater. So we need to be clear and specific. We need to do everything in our power that we can. I would take you back to a previous chapter where Abraham sent Eliezer to find a wife for Isaac. And he went to the well and he set up this great scheme, and he did everything that he could to fulfill his part. And I think, and don't hear me suggest that you should not pray until you have done everything that you can. I think there should, those two should overlap. But what could Isaac do in order to give his wife children? The only thing he can do is have sex with his wife. That's the extent of his involvement in the situation. That's the extent of her involvement in the situation. There's nothing else he can do to fulfill this great promise that he has probably heard many times from his father Abraham regarding seed as grand as the seashore and the stars in the sky. What can he do to fulfill that? Especially when 20 years has gone by and his wife isn't having children. The only thing he can do is have sex with his wife. Period. He has to do everything that he can within his power to effect it. We have to wait patiently. That's obviously incredibly challenging. I think that we should wait patiently if we are confident that the course of action that we are seeking or the outcome that we are seeking is God's will. Obviously, in this situation, Isaac and Rivkah are very much aware that they have to have children. Jacob especially. It could be, in his mind, he could think like, gosh, I'm sure this probably tore him up. He might be thinking to himself, well, maybe it's not Rivkah that I'm supposed to have children with. Maybe she's going to die, and I'm going to marry someone else when she's dead, and we're going to have children that way. He has no idea what's going to happen, but he does know through the promises, if he believes them, that he's supposed to have a boatload of children. These children have to come from somewhere. So, I believe that he can be confident in God's will, that God is going to give him children. But he has to wait patiently. Now, how long should we wait, and how patiently should we be? If you're not confident that God's will is the thing that you're looking for, you may have to be willing to hear no. That's a problem for us. And relinquish our will and say, not my will, but yours be done. So, that's my brief overview regarding addressing God in prayer that's kind of extracted a little bit from this section with Isaac and Rebekah. It's only from one sentence. Obviously, I'm extrapolating quite a bit. But I think the principles are sound. Does anyone agree or disagree with those ideas or have something that they would add to that?
That's perfect. God says, pray, wait, it could be yes, no.
Yeah. Absolutely. So if we're confident that it could happen and it seems like it could be God's will, then just wait patiently. If we have no idea, then be willing to hear the word no. You might be shutting the door. Carla?
I think also be willing to look at experiences of others.
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
he probably knew from his mom and dad how it worked earlier with Hagar, and maybe that wasn't, such a grand idea.
Yes.
So, everyone before us has experienced that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak.
Absolutely. Good insight. Tammy?
I was just going to say, like, the Lord's Prayer is a good example of really how we are to pray.
Yep.
And how we should be praying.
Yep. Great example.
Yeah.
I think that, a study of the Lord's Prayer is so amazing, just the different elements that are in there. It covers everything. It's a great, great piece of wisdom.
Well, I'll just give an example. I have a granddaughter that had 5 miscarriages.
Right.
And now she has a boy and a girl.
Yeah.
So
Isn't that amazing? That's amazing. And I have a friend who's, she's probably 35 or something, and she's a very devout Catholic, and I have not met many of those. Her and her husband were very devout Catholics, and they had been trying to get pregnant for well over a decade, probably 12 or 13 years. And they had prayed, and they had gone to fertility treatments, and they had spent buku bucks trying to come up with a child. And then they decided to give up and said, I guess it's just not God's will. The next month she was pregnant. After she had stopped all the fertility treatments, after they had just given up hope of having a child, they had one beautiful little daughter who's doing well. That was amazing to me. It was an amazing story. God's timing just wasn't lining up with theirs, apparently.
Time is everything.
Absolutely, it is. But we're not known for being a patient lot. I understand this very clearly. No, I know. So she does have this pregnancy and the complications, and she begins to. And this is the hard part, and we'll deal a little bit more with this later, where God reveals to her regarding these 2 children that are in her womb. There's no way she could have known that. They didn't have 3D ultrasounds in those days. So all she knows is something's going on inside me. And I mean, it's the rabbis tell us that this was a serious battle that was happening in her womb. This was not something unusual. It's not like, oh, isn't that cute? The baby's kicking. No, this is like, there's something seriously wrong happening inside of me. And that's why she was alarmed. And she went to inquire of Yehovah regarding what is going on with me. And so, yes, it was revealed to her, and we'll read that in just a moment. But what is she going to do with that information? That's a huge, huge thing, and we're not sure what she did with that information. Sometimes you can read in the text what happens in the next chapter, and you think, maybe she didn't tell her husband at all. And then you think, well, maybe she did, and he just didn't like it. Well, we'll deal with that. It's kind of interesting. So the children are fighting, and there's obviously rampant speculation about what's going on there. And then Rivkah gets this revelation. So I want to just read that to you in Genesis 25:23. In Genesis 25:23, Yehovah speaks to her regarding her. I'm going to back up one verse to 22, and it says, "And within her the children struggled together, and she said, 'If all is right, why am I this way?'" That's a curious phraseology there. It's hard to translate. You might have multiple different ideas about what that says. And so she went to ask of Yehovah. And Yehovah said to her, "2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. And 1 people shall be stronger," more resilient, not sure, "than the other, and the older will serve the younger." And when her days were filled, behold, twins were in her womb. So, let's move forward just a little bit. The conflict. The parents begin to take sides with the children. And it's always been curious to me the way these parents have done this. And I know that, children and parents playing favorites is, we all somehow in our minds think you can't play favorites. You just can't. You have to love all your children equally. And yet, we know that in your deepest, darkest recesses of your mind that you have an affinity with a particular child. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But taking that child's side against another child, that's a different story. That's a different story. So, interesting to note regarding Isaac seeming to favor what we would oftentimes consider the evil son. We see Isaac favoring Esau because and here's a fascinating section here. If you look at Genesis 25:28, it says that Yitzak loved Esau because he ate of his wild game, but Rivkah loved Yaakov. Now, here's something fascinating. This seems to be suggesting that Isaac is behaving if this translation that I have read, that that Yitzak, Isaac, loved Jacob because of his stomach. It's like, I love this son of mine because he's a hunter and he brings me good food. That seems very fleshly. It seems very materialistic, kind of. And it seems totally out of character for this man, one of the patriarchs, to love this son because he gives him food for his belly. I mean, he's a wealthy man, and he has great flocks and herds and servants, and we're going to read here in the next chapter that he, reaps 100-fold when he plants grain during a famine. He's incredibly wealthy. Why does he value Esau's wild game so much? I mean, I like wild game as much as the next guy, but
he said it was savory.
He said it was savory. Yeah, Carla?
I'm just kind of trying to think of the culture, and being Esau's the firstborn, Isaac knows he's the one that's going to have to care for him later.
Sure.
And so he wants somebody that will do that and feed him and care for him. And so he's encouraging him in that talent, in that skill.
Sure.
To,
Yeah, I could see that. I can see that. And yet, that also seems self-serving. Because it's like, this is my firstborn son, and he's going to have to take care of me when I'm old, so I better treat him well. I mean, there's some practicality in that. And yet, it somehow seems like, it also seems a little bit out of character for me, for this spiritual, guy. Gracie?
Well, I don't know about back then. It doesn't seem like it'd be a whole lot different than now, that a man would be glad for the manly son. And
Sure.
look down on the wimpy one that stays
The guy who dwells in the tent and stays with mom and reads books? The bookworm? No, I totally understand. Yeah, that's possible.
Another consideration is, and I don't know if it applies right here, but it does say later that Isaac could not see well.
Yes.
So you could look at that as a spiritual application, that maybe he doesn't see the full picture
Beautiful.
of everything.
Beautiful,
and
yeah.
this is why he taxes.
Absolutely good insight, and I think that's a key thing here, that Isaac, near the end of his life, as we're approaching this next section, that says that he's going blind, and I think that there's every reason that we should probably apply, or at least look at, the spiritual idea of spiritual blindness in that regard. Jerry?
At this point in time, Isaac is only 80 years old, isn't he?
Well, no, it seems... Well, yeah, unfortunately, it seems considerably older than that. According to the according to the calculations, he's going to send Jacob away to go and find a bride, and according to the calculations, Jacob is 70 years old when he leaves. That's a pretty big difference. So it's fairly certain that if Isaac is already going blind and he lives that long, it seems like the time between when the children are born and all of this stuff is happening is some good deal of time has passed. Great.
Isn't it that this time when Esau goes and is so famished, isn't this the time when Abraham passes?
That is very possible.
So that
Yes.
figure out the age of.
Yes, that's one of the things that the rabbis use to calculate it, is they anticipate at the end of this chapter that the reason that this there's a couple of key things here. One is that Jacob is the one who's cooking the stew, which is very odd because men don't cook in those days. However, that is most likely because of the traditions in the Jewish culture regarding sitting Shiva, which is when someone dies, the immediate family members and their children do not do any work, and the work is passed off to one of the grandchildren or something like that. So they anticipate that perhaps that is why he was cooking. Also, the meal in particular that he was cooking. Often when sitting Shiva, they will serve eggs and bean soup, because these elements are round and they represent the circle of life and the cycles of life or something. There's some Jewish traditions wrapped up in there, but there's a good evidence to suggest that Abraham had died and that was the situation that was going on when he was cooking, and that the Bekor, this firstborn son, had shown up in the middle of Grandpa's funeral, having been on a hunting trip. His priorities are all whacked out. So there's that. But the interesting thing about this phrase that we read here, that Yitzak loved Esav because he ate of his wild game. Note something quite fascinating when you look at that phrase in the Hebrew. It says, Vayahav Yitzak et Esav ki Sayid ohevet et Yaakov. It says that he loved Isaac, Esav, ki, because Sayid, hunting. It doesn't say game was in his mouth. It says hunting was in his mouth. Now, you could potentially translate that as game, because that is one of the potential ways to translate that. And yet, in a lot of instances, that word is used for hunting. Now, for those of you who are hunters, and don't hear me say anything negative about hunting, but you know that there are only a couple of instances in the Bible where hunting is mentioned. Mm-hmm. What's the first one? Nimrod. Nimrod was the first, and this is the exact same word. What do we know when we studied Nimrod? He was a mighty hunter. What was he hunting? He was hunting men. He was not hunting animals. He was hunting men. There's a very real opportunity to translate this as Isaac favored Esav because hunting was in Esav's mouth. He was good at trapping men with his words, and that he had pulled the wool over the eyes of his father. That Isaac was not favoring the game that Esav was bringing him, that he loved him because hunting was in Esau's mouth.
That's really.
Yes, sir.
Well, wasn't Abraham's favorite Ishmael as well?
No.
At first?
Not well. He loved him, and he went to Yehovah and said, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." And he says, "No, nevertheless." So we have every reason to believe that Abraham loved him, and yet he wasn't the son of promise. So, it's a difficult situation. But I think that this is a very interesting proposition to look at. And that goes along with what Carla said a moment ago regarding Isaac becoming blind in his old age and having potentially his spiritual sight diminished, that his son had deceived him. The rabbis have possibly interpreted it this way. It's a popular interpretation. And they have said that one of the things that Esau would do is go to his father and ask him, how do I tithe salt and dill and cumin? It's interesting because Yeshua said the same thing. Well, the thing is that the Torah does not require you to tithe salt and mint and dill and cumin. That they say that he did that to persuade his father, try to convince his father that he was punctilious regarding the observing of the commandments, but he only did it to try and trick his father into thinking he was a righteous person, but he was absolutely not. And that he tricked his father, and he pulled the wool over his eyes because he had game in his mouth. It's a fascinating idea. So consider that. Next is Rivkah favoring Jacob. Doesn't say what she did and doesn't say why. It just says that she favors him. Don't know what to do with that one. But she'll take action regarding that favor pretty soon, and that's a whole different story. And that really has to do with seeking good but not doing it in a good way. And I know that you have probably heard, and you will again when we study Exodus regarding when it says righteousness, righteousness you shall pursue. And that's not for emphasis, okay? Whenever you see words repeated in the Bible, it's not for emphasis. There's some spiritual principle behind that. And I think in that particular case, it says, seek righteousness in a righteous way. Because you can do righteousness, but in a very bad way.
Lord, I just read all that today.
Yeah. So you can have a righteous outcome, but the path that you choose to get there can be completely unrighteous. So that's a tough situation, and we'll see.
But righteousness in that time meant right character too.
Yes, absolutely. Doing what is right
Right.
gives you right character.
Right.
Yeah, they're all tied together very nicely. So Rivkah will try to get to the right end, but in the wrong way. Carla?
I'm just looking at what we said earlier, and it makes me think that Rivkah maybe didn't have that partial blindness,
Yeah.
and so she saw Esau for what he was in deceit
Yeah,
towards two
yeah.
men.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a couple of things that you might consider in that regard. Number one, women are often more spiritually discerning than men. Just ask my wife, she'll tell you. And B, she had a direct revelation from God regarding this child before he was even born. Not that he was evil or wicked or something, but that one would be stronger or more stout than the other, but the older would serve the younger. She might have inferred from that multiple things. Jerry?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. Like Sarah back with Abraham, she thought she'd help God out by.
Yes.
Hagar.
Yes.
Hagar.
Our efforts to help God rarely go well. Absolutely.
But you knew that the younger was supposed to get the blessing because the older was going to serve the younger.
Yeah,
But she did.
right.
This isn't working out right, so I'm going to help out a little bit here.
That never ever works.
Just as Jacob was.
Yeah, that never ever works well. But nevertheless, she took it upon herself to do that. And then we have this section regarding the spiritual alignment of the children. And we've spent a good deal of time on this when we studied the book of Genesis, a couple of years ago. And if you want to dig deeper into this section, you go back and listen to that in Genesis 25, because we spent a good deal of time, a couple of weeks probably, just dealing with this idea of Esau being a cunning hunter, which is just, again, the exact same language that is used of Nimrod, and being a man of the field, which we know that Yeshua tells us that the field is the world. He's a worldly man with worldly appetites, and he represents the flesh. I don't want to say, it might be dangerous to mischaracterize Esau to a great degree by saying he's evil and Jacob is good. That's not exactly the picture I think that we're supposed to get here. The picture I think we're supposed to get here is that this is a deep spiritual portrayal of how to operate in the flesh versus how to operate in the spirit, and that these must be balanced. You can't become, well, you could become an ascetic and live in a cave and be ultra spiritual and be absolutely useless to anyone. That's getting the spiritual out of balance. Or you can become very fleshly and cast aside the needs of anyone for any reason and only be interested in what's in it for me. That is the other out of balance. So we have to balance these two things. And so I want you to just keep in mind that Esau has some negative connotations regarding him. There's no question that there's some negative connotations here, but I think it's connotations in regard to our own natures being ruled by our flesh and not necessarily good versus evil. Okay? Remember that for whatever reason, if Esau was a purely wicked and evil person, then why, when the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, he's telling them, oh, over there is Mount Seir, where your relatives, Esau's descendants, live. don't go near them. They're going to be afraid of you, and I am not giving you even an inch of their ground that you could even put your foot on. That's theirs. I've given it to them. And that's God seemingly, but then there's another passage that you've read, that Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. You can twist yourself into knots trying to explain away what he means by hated. Well, I think hated is a pretty good translation of that Hebrew term. It is what it is. But there's some balance there. Angela?
He hates the flesh.
He hates the flesh is probably a good way to look at it. What he represents, not him and the people descended from him as a people group necessarily. Interesting to note that to a Jew, Esau, do you know what Esau represents to a Jew? Christianity. Christianity. Rome, the Romans, Westernism, Jesus Christ and his followers, that's Esau. There are multiple reasons why. They believe that Rome was not founded by Romulus and Remus, by some ancient Tuscan brothers, but by Esau. How did Esau get from Mount Seir over to the 7 hills of Rome? Who knows? But the Jews believe that Esau was the founder of Rome, and that the Roman people, for various reasons, are represented by Esau, and that Esau is Christianity. It's a very strange thing. Angela?
This whole brothers thing, even with the myth of Romulus and Remus,
Mm-hmm.
if you go back to your very first man of the field, he killed his brother.
Mm-hmm.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, yeah, same picture.
And that whole thing about the balance that Alan was talking about, you're trying to achieve between the physical and the spiritual, and be this being that lives in both. He said, sin's crouching at the door.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very difficult thing to navigate.
Absolutely.
But you cannot give in and let that rule over.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, note also that Esau determined at some point in his life that he wanted to kill Jacob. I think there's a good indication that your flesh would like to kill your spirit. Not literally, because it can't, but what it would like to do is shut it up and get it out of the way, because your spirit is the thing that gets in the way of the good times. You know what I'm saying? That when the flesh wants to get out of control, it hates the spirit putting the brakes on with your conscience, getting in the way. That's the spirit getting in the way, and your flesh would love to kill your spirit, but it doesn't say that your spirit wants to kill your flesh. Jacob doesn't want to kill Esau. Esau wants to kill Jacob. So there's a little lesson there as well. Now it says that Jacob is a Tom man. This is an interesting thing because this Tamim is the same word that was used of Noah. It says that Noah was a righteous man, pure in his generations. Same word, Tom. So this young man is Tom. Seems to be indicating a certain type of purity, a certain type of righteousness, and he lives in tents. What does this mean? Is he suffering from agoraphobia? Is he not? He doesn't like going outside. What I think it means potentially, and this is what a lot of people have interpreted as, is that he's a man who studies. Mm-hmm. He's a person who studies under his grandfather and his father the words of God. It could be a bit of romanticizing. Nevertheless, he's more of a domesticated man than a rugged, hairy dude. John?
Do you think that with Jacob, we talked about it a couple of years ago, I think, that like Esau was you could almost see through him what type of man he was. Mm. But Jacob started out very, very bad. 2 times he does very bad things, and then he starts to grow. But I still struggle with that one. People
very much struggle with Jacob. Some of the things that he does. He makes some really dumb decisions, and so it's challenging to. It's not, when we say that this is a good metaphor for the spirit versus the flesh, it's not a pure metaphor for sure.
Very, very bad in a way.
Yeah.
Yet it's constantly, even from the beginning, dat jouw vader zegt van, he is the one, basically.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
and he favors.
Yeah, absolutely. Angela?
Isn't that kind of though what his people have done?
That's what his people have done, and so that's why I say it's a loose metaphor, because you can't say acting in a spiritual fashion. And if Jacob was a purely spiritual man,
Right from the start, we've been messing it up.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Right from the start, we've been messing
Why
it up.
wouldn't this little microcosmic story of our history
Yeah.
mess it up?
No, absolutely.
Yeshua.
What's that?
Why do we need Yeshua? We all mess it up.
Sure,
So
yeah.
to me, it's like, thank you, Lord, for these real life people.
Yeah, that's very true, and you'll find that that's very much true in the Hebrew literature, which is not true in any other religious literature of any other people group on the planet. They always portray their gods and their deities and their heroes in flawless language where they don't do anything wrong and they're just perfect and they're strong and brave and handsome and they don't mess up at all. Whereas the Bible and its heroes are just painted in all of their flaws and it's just kind of ugly sometimes. But that's encouraging to me, A, and B, it also tells me that this is a more realistic document that is trying to teach us some things in reality and not, give us fantastic tales. So that.
With Abraham in a way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Abraham made lots of dumb mistakes, so that's encouraging.
No one gets to share his glory.
No one gets to share his
These
glory.
other
That's true.
religions, there's glory,
Yeah.
goes
Well, and
down to all these demigods.
Yeah, absolutely.
In our religion, the only one who gets the glory because the rest of them are all messed up.
That's a good thing. Yeah, no one can take glory from God. Period. And interesting thing too is looking at this this dichotomy of the chosen line. You have mentioned and noted, obviously, that there seems to be this thing happening where the firstborn son is not being chosen to be in the line of this special chosen people. The firstborn son is passed over. And I got to tell you that my children, when they were younger reading this, Hayden did not like this. He's like, man, God's going to pass me over for my little brother? No, that's not a principle in the scripture. It just happened. But what's interesting is that you can see that this is the genesis of the Hebrew people, right? So Abraham, the first Hebrew, the one who crosses over. And you can interpret crosses over in so many ways, literally and spiritually both.
The verb is
Ebru, yes. So what's interesting is that Abraham is the first Hebrew. And he has two children, and only one of them is a Hebrew. The other one is not. And then Jacob, or Isaac, is the Hebrew, and Ishmael is not. And then Isaac has two sons. And Esau is not a Hebrew. Jacob is a Hebrew. And what's interesting about Jacob is that all of his sons are Hebrews. Every single one of them. This trail is diverging in some way. Because
He named Israel.
and he named the whole kingdom, his whole kingdom after this kid. And you can see this dichotomy also of this balancing thing of Abraham on the left side and, well, on the left or right, don't attribute spiritual weight to left and right in this instance. I'm just saying Abraham over here, things seem to go really smoothly for Abraham. Even when he messed up, good came out of it. When he lied about Sarah being his wife, he walked away wealthy. When he lied to Abimelech about his wife, he walked away wealthy.
How do you think that is?
I'm going to get to that. But everything seemed to go really well for him. For Jacob, nothing goes right for him. Nothing at all. Seems like anything that could possibly go wrong went wrong for Jacob. And then you got Isaac in the middle, where you have very little information except for these wells. We'll get to that in a sec. So what's interesting is these are two polar opposites of each other. Abraham and his grandson Jacob, very, very different. And I think that this is showing us a spiritual progression. let me deal with that in a little. Let me deal with that in a moment. Just keep that thought in mind. I've already discussed. This is not necessarily good and evil, but spirit versus flesh. And Esau begins to reveal what is inside of him, and he is nicknamed Edom, which means red, but not because of the red stew that he ate, but because of his appetite. I think that you'll see from that he is nicknamed. His name is Esav, which means hairy, so he was called hairy. His name was hairy, but Edom is his nickname, and it means red. Interesting to note also that the word Seir, the mountain region that he travels to eventually, also means hairy. I don't know what a hairy mountain is. Maybe it's got trees on it and it looks hairy. Who knows? But he is not called red because of his hair is red or his skin is red or because he ate red beans. It's because his appetite. The red adjective is describing his appetite, that he was willing to give up anything in order to just fill his belly. So that's why he is nicknamed Edom. He is driven by his appetite and is willing to discard spiritual blessings, and he's willing to trade the rights and the responsibilities of the firstborn son in order to get a meal, which is fascinating. But you have to understand, too, that this is not just the firstborn rights, but the firstborn privileges. I think he wanted the firstborn rights. He did not want the firstborn responsibilities. Yeah, because that means, what are some of the rights, what are some of the responsibilities of the firstborn, the Bekorah? Does anyone know what a responsibility is? Yes, they have to take over for the father when he's too old to do it or when he dies, to take over the spiritual leadership of the whole clan, to take care of the parents. They have to take care of to make sure that the daughters are married off to good families, the clan finances, discipline within the clan. There's a lot of responsibilities, administrative duties, if you will, that come with the firstborn.
Not a lot of time for you to do what you want.
No, there's no time to go hunting and fulfill your own pleasures because you're looking out for the interests of others. Tammy?
I was going to say, it's interesting you say that because I was reading this week about how God seems to use the second child, the younger child, like in David and Joseph, and different ones like that. And I thought that's really interesting. So the firstborn gets, like all of the inheritance and this and that, but he generally uses.
Yeah, he does. He kind of bypasses the firstborn. And what's interesting, in all of those cases that you cited, none of those firstborns received either the rights or the duties of the firstborn. All of those firstborn sons, even of the 12 sons of Jacob or of Israel, the firstborn, the secondborn, the thirdborn were all passed over, and each of these sons was also passed over. Angela, and then Jerry.
I think it's a pattern that's alluding to the first Adam and the second Adam. It's trying to show the firstborn.
Good insight. Yeah, there being an idea of it being a pattern of showing the first Adam and the second Adam. Yeah, absolutely.
Blessings that come through Adam, that's where we got our curse. Our
Sure.
blessings come through the second Adam.
It's
Good-
interesting
good
because
point.
Adam probably was hairy. In
Yeah, Jerry?
How old
I was going to say when
in the second Adam
Yeshua was hanging on the cross,
Yeah.
just before he died, he looks down at his mother, and it says, John,
Behold.
behold, something like that, be responsible for my mother.
Yep.
He was fulfilling his first son's responsibility to make sure mom was taken care of.
Yeah.
And he also knew that all the other disciples would be dead. So
Yes.
John would be the only one left alive, so he's the only one that could do it.
That's a great observation, Jerry. You think about the idea that when Yeshua was dying on the cross, it is fairly confident that his father Joseph had died by then, and that he himself, being the firstborn son, was no longer going to be able to take care of his mother, and so he passes that responsibility on to his disciple John, whom he loved seemingly more than the others, playing a little favorites there, which is interesting also. And also knowing that John would live the longest of the disciples, it's a very interesting tie-in, absolutely.
And he knew that John would live the longest.
Yes, he did. Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. So now I want to take you to the wells. And really the only chapter 26, the only real information that we get regarding Jacob. And this is hard. This is complicated and a little difficult and a little challenging, but I want to walk through it with you a little bit as much as I can. So note that right at the beginning of this section, history almost repeats itself. That a famine comes into the land, and he seems to be ready to pack it up. And where do you think he's heading? He's heading to Egypt. But it says that he goes to the land of the Philistines, to Abimelech. Now, this is not likely the same Abimelech as in the days of Abraham. It could be, but it doesn't. Not necessarily. It's
Isaac going there?
yes. Isaac goes to the same place with the same name of a guy called Abimelech, which just means my father is king. It could be a title, a kingly father, father king kind of thing. It could just be a title, or it's possible that it could be the same guy. He'd be pretty darn old. But it's likely not the same guy. But what seems to happen here is that we got another famine. He begins to feel uncertain, and he thinks, okay, I got to head somewhere else, and he begins to move. But then God stops him. He says, don't go down to Egypt. Stay here. And I want you to take note, and I'm going to turn there briefly to just kind of to show you that what God says to him exactly, because you want to put a little note in your Bible regarding this word. So he says, do not go down to Egypt in Genesis 26:2. And then he says, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you, for I give all these lands to you and to your seed, and I shall establish the oath which I swore to Abraham your father, and I will increase your seed like the stars of the heavens, and I shall give all these lands to your seed, and in your seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. What's interesting is that the Hebrew word in verse 3, if you look at that in the Hebrew, you're going to see two words that God is actually using here to tell him where he should be. You're going to see shachan, and you're going to see gur. You heard that word gur before, or something that sounds like it? Ger, stranger. It's the same word. But shachan is another word which basically means to lie down. So, but then when you jump forward a little bit, and there's a different word used, and I'll point that out to you in a moment. But God says to him, stay here. Don't go anywhere else. Because it seems like he's on his way to Egypt to do the exact same thing that his father Abraham had done. When the famine comes, he decides, I'm going to a land where there's water that's continuously flowing. There's a river. There's generally going to be food there all the time. He's like, no, stay here. In fact, interesting to note that Isaac is the only one of the patriarchs who was not only born in the land, he never left the land. He never left the land, the promised land. Interesting idea. Angela?
That's, I had,
Oh, you were holding your hand up.
no, I was just agreeing.
Oh, okay. So he, again, and you can see in 26:5, he confirms this covenant again with Isaac. And it is during this time that it says that he actually planted a barley crop during this famine and reaps 100-fold. That's tremendous. That is tremendous. And I'm certain that the Philistines saw what was happening with him, and they began to be afraid. And they shortly thereafter asked him to leave. Because not only does he plant crops in the midst of a famine and yields 100-fold, That had to have blown the Philistines' minds. It's like, what is going on with this guy? We got no rain, our wells are going dry, and here he is planting a huge crop of barley, and it comes up 100-fold. What has he got, magic beans? Where's Jack that's giving him the magic beans? So but then it says further that he increased, and he increased even more until the Philistines basically had to address him and say, you are too mighty for us. Please go away. Key idea, okay? And I think that this key idea is that right after God says to him in these verses that I just read to you, that he says, I want you to sojourn in the land and be a stranger, be a sojourner in the land. But what does it say? It says in verse 6 that Isaac dwelt in Gerar. That's a very different word. It's yashav. It means to settle down permanently. What's interesting is God seems to be saying to Isaac, you're a tenant here for now. Don't get comfortable. Settle down, but don't settle down. But Isaac settles down. He decides to plant some roots. And you might think of it as it begins to go to his head, and he begins to think in a more permanent way than he really should have. Because as he begins to grow and yashav in this land, he begins to probably plant more crops, put up some permanent buildings to store his crops and all of his goods. Then he begins to dig some wells, and we see a foreshadowing here. Because the first time that he begins to dig these wells, the first well, the people of the land pop up and say, this belongs to us. You can't dig here. This is our land. Notice that we have some contention building regarding this land. So he moves a little bit further away and he digs again. That first well that they began to fight over, he called it Esek, which means contention, strife. Now he digs another well a little bit further away and he calls it Sitna, because again they came and fought with him regarding this is our land and this is our water. Note, you know something in that, you look at the name of that well, you notice that is the same word, Satan, but with a hay on the end of it, and it means the same thing, the accuser. Fascinating little nugget there that you might want to put away into your pipe so you can smoke it later.
Is that 18?
Yes.
That well.
Yep, that is Sitna. Fascinating. It's a shin, tet, nun. The same three words that spell Satan, the Satan, which is the accuser. It's the same word, but with a hay on the end, which is also interesting. So he's trying to establish himself even further, because you got to remember that digging a well, making improvements on land signifies what? Ownership. You can't make improvements to land that you don't own. Nevertheless, it is supposed from the rabbinic interpretation of this passage that what is happening here is that Isaac has begun to get a little ahead of himself, and that he is thinking, I'm going to start settling down here. I've got the people, I've got the resources, I'm going to claim it. Now you've heard name it and claim it. Well, he's naming it and claiming it. And God is saying, no, not yet. And you can see that the adversary is coming against him, and you can see that God is not giving him victory in this area right now. Because I think there's a lesson that he wants to show him here. It says then that with this third well, he calls it, because no one fights for it, no one steps up and says, hey, this is ours, he calls it Rechaboth, which is the root word Rahab, the harlot from Jericho, same word, which means wideness. Now, I don't think that's telling us that Rahab was fat. I think what it's telling us maybe is that she was wideness as in expansive and generous and kind. I believe so. This one works. Why? What is happening in the verse right before it tells us about this one particular well that actually works? What does he do? They strove with him. They strove with him again in verse 21. And he moved from there. He pitched his tent. Same exact phrase that happens in the life of his grandfather Abraham. When it says that he began to have problems with the Philistines, he pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. Same thing. He's starting to recognize, I'm just a sojourner here. His attitude changes. He's not trying to settle down roots. He's figuring out, okay, this doesn't mean that you literally need to live in a tent, but he did. It says he pitched his tent. That is sukkah. Same thing that we celebrate for Sukkot. We got to remember, and he needed to be taught, you're a temporary resident here right now. I'm giving this land to you and your descendants, but not yet. I need you to behave as a temporary resident. When he began to get a little uppity and decide, I'm going to start taking possession of this land, conflict. Yeah. The people of the land began to have conflict. Okay? And then it says that he moved there and he dug another well and they did not strive over it. And that one is called Rehoboth. And for now, Yehovah has made room for us and we will be fruitful in the land. And then he pitched his tent again and he left and he went to a new place called the Well of Seven. They found water there as well and he called it Be'er Sheva, which means well of seven. Now, you could potentially attach some significance to the well of seven. Some people have said this is the well of the sevenfold oath. It's an interesting idea because of some other things that happen here in this area. And you know, of course, that when Yeshua meets the woman at the well in John chapter 4, she says to him, you're not greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well. That's the well of the sevenfold oath. It's the same one. Okay, so this well that Jacob dug here is very likely the same one that Samaritan woman was sitting next to in the middle of the day when Yeshua came up to her and said, give me a drink of water. So, amazing principles here that bitterness and jealousy are aroused because of the blessings that are given to Jacob when he thinks that he's ready to settle down. And Yehovah needs to back him up a little bit and say, hey, be a sojourner. There is so much applicability to us in being sojourners and not trying to plant roots firmly in this life. Right? We have to continuously remind ourselves. And unfortunately, it can be painful because we like to dig our roots down and hold on. And that becomes an idol in our lives. The blessings of God can become an idol in our lives. And you know what God does with idols. He destroys them. And the more tightly you're holding on to those idols, the more it hurts when he needs to take these damaging and dangerous things away from you. So, bitter jealousy arises, and then his attitude changes, and he begins to pick up and move along, and not be so firmly attached. And then we have the Well of Seven.
So this Genesis 26, this happens before the boys are born, right?
Yes, it is. Yes,
so like
it is. Yeah, exactly. Yes, absolutely. That's a good point, Keith. That the Bible is not always giving us chronological order. So that's very. We have every reason to believe that this happened before the boys were actually born. Yes. And you got this. I didn't even mention the fact that he said she's my sister. So you can see the whole thing with Abraham being played over and over again.
This fills in that 20 years you were talking about
Yeah.
when they didn't have the kids.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Angela? I want to point out one other thing before Angela comes here. Notice that once Jacob's attitude changes and he begins to see himself as a sojourner, that the people of the land come to him and say, "We have seen, indeed seen," repeated, "that Yehovah is with you. Make a covenant with us." And they do. What does that sound like to you? Something that I am repeating to you over and over and over and over and over. Your actions speak louder than your words. That because his attitude changed, he was no longer at war with the people around him. In fact, his witness, if you want to call it that, became effective. And the people came to him and said, "We can see that God is with you. Make a treaty with us. Make a covenant with us." They had already seen that God was with him before. But what did they do? They kicked him out. They were afraid and they were jealous. And they said, "Leave." But now, why are they suddenly coming to him and saying, "We can see that God is with you. Be kind to us and to our descendants. Don't do evil to us and to our descendants." Fascinating what they say to him. I think this shows you pretty clearly that there's a progression in Jacob's life taking place here. And that his attitude is changing dramatically. And God is making his witness effective. Because it's only once his attitude changes and he begins to view himself in relation to God's promises a little bit more tenuously, holding on loosely, if you will, that the people step up and say, "We can see that God is with you." And they say it twice. "We can see, behold, we can see that God is with you." Fascinating. Angela? June?
Just like us sometimes, our attitude towards other people.
Yeah.
And then when the Lord kind of knocks us down and gets us straight,
Yep.
our attitude changes, and then those people that we had an attitude towards might come to the Lord and stuff.
That very, very true. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Angela, did you want to?
If you have time.
We do. The next chapter is 27, and that is most especially concerned with, putting on the hairy garment and pretending to be your brother so that you can get the blessing. And like I said, we dealt extensively with that before, and everybody knows that story. But I didn't think that everybody knew what we were talking about here, and it was a little bit more helpful, perhaps. So I'm going to.
Before you,
yes.
Actually, before
No,
you
go ahead.
Quick question. So he gets better, when he does the right thing. He really is growing after that first incident, and then chapter 27 hits you. Why are you doing that?
Yeah.
You're spiritually growing. You set good examples even to others.
Yeah. And you got to remember what we saw in the life of Abraham, that he would reach this spiritual plateau where things are going along good, and then a test comes and you just fall right off that cliff. I can't explain it any way other than that. It's just what happens. You get a little brig for your britches and you get thrown off a mountain. Angela?
Does anybody else want to? Because it's just coming together. I've been looking at this section for over a year. And some of the things that he said, we should talk more often. But this is when it happens. Some of the things he said are causing some ideas to kind of kick in. And so this is going to be kind of an incomplete thing. I don't know if it'll even make sense. I'll try to make it fast so that I don't waste too much of your time. Oh, okay. So it seems like, he talked about the birth of Jacob and Esau and the twins in the womb and the conflict between, and we said that the spiritual meaning there was the battle between the flesh and the spirit, right? I think that whole idea of flesh versus spirit and finding the balance and having the younger rule over the older, having our spirit rule over our flesh and finding that balance. Not being all in one or all in the other,
but finding a balance and having that one in charge. I think that that's a theme here for longer than you might have considered before. When he's talking about these wells, because that was the most curious thing to me, was this odd story about the well, because it talks a lot about Abraham, a lot of stories about Abraham, a lot of stories about Jacob. Isaac, we don't get much, but we do get this weird story about the well, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so why? Why, of all things you're going to say about Isaac, why the well? So Alan was talking about just now, he said some phrases I tried to write down. I'll try to put this in some kind of order for you. This thing about Isaac being a temporary resident, he shouldn't have yeshaved there or really settled down, put down roots. He was supposed to be a temporary resident and kind of sojourn in that land. In that land. Okay, what are we made out of?
Dirt. Temporary dirt.
Land.
We're in a, yeah.
And when we celebrate Sukkot, we're celebrating days in our temporary what? A temporary sukkah. What does that temporary sukkah represent?
Physical body.
This physical body that we inhabit. You know, there's that whole thing of, are you a spirit with a body, or are you a body with a spirit? Because those are two entirely different things. Think about that later. So, if this body that you're in is your temporary thing, Esau obviously was pretty invested in satisfying the appetite of his physical body, right? No concern for the spirit. Okay, so when we get to this well thing, if you look at Genesis for a while here, if you start and you can take a picture of this if you want to later. Okay, there's a chiasm here, and I think there is. I'm pretty sure there is. Okay, so, and I put all the references, so you can take a picture and look this up if you want to, but there's a reference to thigh in Genesis 24, and there's a reference to thigh in Genesis 32. Okay, do you remember what this thigh is?
With Eliezer, place your hand under my thigh.
Do you remember what this thigh is?
With Jacob telling Joseph to place his hand under his thigh.
No. This is the wrestling angel.
Oh, when he dislocated his thigh. Okay, gotcha.
Okay. The event right after this thigh is crossing over with numbered animals. 10 camels, Eliezer. Yep. Crosses over back into where Abraham came from. Remember when he went to find the bride? Okay, right before this thigh, did you know that Jacob crossed over the Jabbok, and his animals are numbered, the animals that he took. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then if you move in, we have the first recorded prayer here, Eliezer at the well. If you move up here, we have the second recorded prayer.
When Jacob prays, save me from my brother Esau.
Yes. Yeah. If you move in from here, we have Laban introduced for the first time. If you move up from here, we have Laban departs. We never hear from him again. If you move down here, we have this phrase, do not speak bad or good.
Regarding Eliezer requesting the daughter to marry the son. They say we can't say anything good or bad. Right. Yeah.
If you move up from here, you have when God told Laban, do not speak bad or good to Jacob. Mm-hmm. Why is that? I mean, that phrase, isn't this... Yeah. Doesn't there have to be a pattern here? Oh, yes. Okay, if you move in here, you have Laban trying to delay Rebekah from going back to meet Isaac. Remember when he said, just let her stay here for a minute? Mm-hmm. Okay, if you move up from here, you have Laban again trying to delay Jacob from leaving with his wives and children. Yeah. Okay, if you move in from here, you have the story of Isaac and Rebekah. Mm-hmm. If you move up from here, you have the story of Jacob and Rachel. So husband and wife, husband and wife. Yeah. Okay, if you move down, you have the sending away here of Isaac's half-siblings. When Abraham sends them away with their inheritance.
Keturah's children? Okay. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Here you have the sending where Rachel sends away Jacob. His mother, what's his mother's name?
Rivkah?
Yeah, Rebecca.
Rebecca sends Jacob
says,
away.
Get out of here.
Oh, gotcha.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
so
gotcha.
Sending away. Okay, and then if you move in here, it starts getting dicey, and I can't figure this piece out. So maybe you guys can go and have fun with it. But in the center of all this, there seems to be this collection of the birth of Jacob and Esau, the twins in the womb, the spirit, the physical. You have the birthright sold because of the physical appetite. And you have the story of Isaac and Abimelech and that random well.
Yeah.
The well that he was just talking about. Somehow that well is more important than just this little sideline. Okay, we got to say something about Isaac because we haven't told any stories about him. So let's just throw in the story about the well. It's not like that. There's something about this well story, and that well means enough room for everyone. So if you go back to this whole idea of, I don't know if I can put this together, people. That things do not start to go well for him. Remember, he's supposed to be a temporary resident, just as we are in our physical bodies. Don't get too invested in this thing and try to make it, I want to live forever. No, you're not meant to. You're not in this thing. This is corrupt. This is just a vehicle for you. Okay, the land was not ready to be claimed in that way. Our land is not ready to be claimed in that way. I know a lot of people are just counting on that rapture because they don't want to have to die. But I think that there is going to be a form of death. I don't think you're going to take this flesh. Even if there's a rapture, I don't think it's this flesh that's going with you. This land is not ready to be claimed for eternity. It needs some fixing. It wasn't until he pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. Bethel means the house of God. Ai means heap of destruction. Heap of ruins. Okay, there's your balance again. This balance between house of God and our heap of fleshly ruins that we're, just trying to make it through this life in. So the balance is to exist in the in-between, because I've said this before, that the unique thing about a human is we are the physical and the spirit trying to exist together. You've got the beasts, the animals, okay, and their main it's food, sex, just the physical appetites. That's what an animal does.
Yeah.
And the reason why we think that animals act like people is because people are acting more like animals, okay? Appetite, physical, food, sex, reproduction. So it's our job as a human to be that link in between. We have a spirit and we have the body that's made of the ground. We are the link in between that level and that level. And his Torah is trying to show us, give us instructions how to be a good human.
Yeah.
How do you be a good human? How do you be a good example of this balance in between the dirt and the water from above? How do you be that? So,
and maybe the story with the wells, and that what we're maybe supposed to be remembering here is to not get invested too much in the temporary. Don't get invested in the temporary, whether that's life, your fleshly body, the riches that grow wings and fly away. And
you had contention, and then you have the oppressor, Satan, the name of the wells.
Yeah.
Then finally you had room enough for everyone.
Yep. It's a good picture of the entire scope of human history, if you want to call it that, really. It's a good picture of the whole program, so to speak. I think that's a good place for us to stop. We have dug a little deeper into this Torah portion and a little bit different stuff than perhaps previously. Any final questions, comments, or concerns?
Was there also somewhere living water in there that I read?
Yes.
I don't remember where it was.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The words Mayim Chaim is actually definitely in this Torah portion. I don't remember where it is exactly, but I believe it's in relation to one of those wells, and I think it's the last one. It would make sense if it was the last one, but I have to look at that. Mayim Chaim, living water. So consider that. It's an interesting insight. Thank you, John, for bringing that up. Let's pray and we'll fellowship together.